You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
In the wake of the remarkable speed with which researchers brought COVID vaccines into use, expectations do not seem unwarranted for still more medical and health breakthrough developments, in part because the messenger RNA technology underlying the COVID vaccines appears to have broad applicability for the treatment of other diseases. Still, other factors suggest technology will likely spawn still more innovations. Investments in the latter part of the 20th century to digitize medical records have begun to yield dividends in the form of new protocols, novel drugs and regimens, and innovations in the use of diagnostic tools. We set out to find a leader who could talk to us about information technology along with scientific research, both of which seem to fuel invention and innovation in healthcare. We found one. Eric Perakslis is Chief Science and Digital Officer at the Duke Clinical Research Institute of Duke University. He earned a PhD in chemical and biochemical engineering from Drexel University and a master's and undergraduate degree in chemical engineering. We're fortunate on Innovators to learn from leaders in a variety of fields, almost all of whom possess remarkable breadth of professional experience. But Dr. Perakslis' career is particularly broad and noteworthy. So much so that I won't list them all and will instead mention just a few. Immediately prior to joining the Duke Clinical Research Institute, he was at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital. Before that, he served in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Earlier still, he was Senior Vice President and Head of the Research and Development Institute of Takeda Pharmaceuticals, and that company's work in oncology, rare diseases, neuroscience, and other fields. Before that, he also was Senior Vice President Johnson & Johnson's Pharmaceutical R&D Information Technology and at ArQule, a drug development company subsequently acquired by Merck. In his ample free time, Dr. Perakslis serves as an advisor to Datavant and to Doctors Without Borders, as well as scholarly societies and academic and medical journals. I couldn't bring myself to ask him about his hobbies, lest he report many, many ones. Welcome to Innovators. Early in your book, you and Dr. Stanley write, just as most medicines have accompanying undesirable side effects, so do digital health technologies, most of which, and here I quote, we do not fully understand yet. By most accounts, we live in a time of increasing innovation. Moreover, many of these are direct outcomes of digital technology, be they data science, artificial intelligence, simulation, computer modeling. And yet you are explicit in acknowledging that even experts don't always understand all of the ways digital health methods affect patients. And then earlier today, you mentioned a current case that suggests how the use of IT and data can have consequences and uses not necessarily originally intended. Would you mind describing that particular case? Because it seems to me it illustrates exactly what you were talking about.
Sure. So in this particular case, there was a Politico story that detailed a fairly complex operation, and it's an operation that is a crisis support helpline for people having mental health crises, even suicide and whatnot. And there's a lot to unpack, but there's a couple things that really stand out. It is a nonprofit that does support via text and other digital measures like Facebook Messenger and provide counseling that way. And they have a nonprofit that does that. They then take those the documentation of those conversations, because they're text or whatever, and they anonymize and de-identify them. And were using it and are using it to drive a for-profit company that takes the learnings from those conversations and uses that as a business model to help other people improve customer service and other things like that. And, the Politico piece came out, and then there were some really fascinating kind of blow ups on Twitter about it. And, the way I thought about it then is the way I think about it now. I think, first of all, when you're talking about people and systems, you have to draw the system boundaries correctly. So when I think about digital health, if I take those two words, so I do a lot of field work with NGOs and global health and whatnot. And so if you take the word field medicine, what you're really doing is taking the complexity of the field and the complexity of medicine, and you're managing the superset. You're managing the fact that your conditions are different, that the room may not be clean, you may be in a tent, you may not have electricity, things like that. So it's a superset. So when you take digital medicine, what you're then doing is you're taking the complexity, the benefits and the risks of medicine, and the complexity and the benefits risks of the internet, and you're adding them. And so within my book, there's lots of ways to describe digital health. What my co-author and I do is say, we're going to talk about healthcare connected to the internet, because that's really one way to think about what it is. And so, you're dealing with that superset. Now, the piece drove a lot of interesting conversations with ethicists and privacy experts, and the company itself took a very defensive posture, as you'd expect. But the way it came down when I watched everything, the way it came down to me, I thought about it this way. I said, privacy has interdependencies with security, and both have interdependencies with consent. And if you think of that as three large components, it's not you're adding to three the complexity, it's that you're cubing it. Right?
Exactly.
So for example, in this company's response, they talked a lot about their privacy policies. They were proud of their privacy policies. They thought they were very well vetted. And the answer is, well, everything in that article was true, and the privacy policies were kind of not the core of what the thing was about. And so if you think, how does that happen? Well, these are actually really, really complex things. Any of them: privacy, security, ethics, medicine, all these different things. And people have deep expertise in them. You often don't find people that have deep expertise in more than one of them. And so I can take a certain scenario and I can play it out. And if I look at it from the angle of privacy, I'm now taking a four-dimensional thing and looking at it one-dimensionally. So this is actually very, very common in healthcare and in digital health, because people are learning. They're drawing assumptions. They're moving into new things. And initially they have a fairly superficial understanding of what it is. But then they build that understanding over time. One thing that we know is that all medical interventions carry risks. I've seen people handing out $5 mosquito nets in Africa almost cause gang warfare. You wouldn't think, but every intervention causes something. You're perturbing a system, right? And so what we have in digital health is we have a lot of progress in the tech sector. We have a lot of well-meaning, bright people. We have huge differences in background. If you take the mantra of MIT, which is something like go forth and fix things, it doesn't say do no harm. And so you could kind of see how really smart, really well-meaning people all trying to serve humanity could really get crosswise of both trying to do the right thing, but being kind of naive or ignorant, or sometimes in the case of Silicon Valley, willfully ignorant of what's going on. Because when I say willful ignorance, because I've actually advised a lot of these people, and they ain't always listening, to the people that they pay to advise them. And so sometimes you got to say, okay, all right, so now what you're saying is you view this as a feature and I view it as a bug.
I don't think I've ever quite thought of it that way, but let me press you on this, because it does strike me that there are at least two other elements to this. One is the unintended, the unexpected, the unimagined, perhaps. And then there's the other one, which says, wait a minute, we just discovered that this particular tool has some applications that have extraordinary potential, and in some cases, potential to make very large sums of money. So the motivation changes a little bit. I wasn't sure in this particular case, which you've alluded to, I wasn't sure in this case whether the for-profit came about after the not-for-profit or along with. And does that matter in terms of dealing with the actual problem itself?
I actually am aware and worked with lots of nonprofits that have for-profit businesses attached. There's lots of good reasons to do that. And often, they'll take all the profits from the for-profit and they'll feed it back in the NGO. But in this case, there's a couple of things that are going on. First of all, if you think about the core trade here, somebody's contacting this technology capability clearly under duress, in crisis, possibly suicidal. Most would argue that people in that state of mind cannot give informed consent for other uses and stuff like that. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing, because it's technology, this company, like a lot of companies, does what most of us feel is almost worse than not doing consent, and that's they send people to a 50-paragraph end user license agreement. And they have to click to accept it or they can't go forward in the program. So and I don't know that this is the case at all with this thing, but using that metaphor, a suicidal person calls up, is not in a great state of mind to make complex decisions about future things in their life. They're sent to something, and if they don't say yes to something they don't understand, they might be hung up on. So so before you get how this data gets moved downstairs, you kind of left a lot of us at the door scratching our heads on this. Because, but that said, now if you look at the original piece, several of the other quote unquote experts that were interviewed said what I said is there are parts of this that are probably completely legal. And it's not, and it doesn't mean that they're right, it just means they're not illegal. Meaning no one's ever written a law against them. It's a very different, just something's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. This is, regulation has always been rear looking. You can't regulate a product that didn't exist before. And, one of the best advantages of this, you take something like the Food and Drug Association with something like the vaping industry. Electronic cigarettes didn't exist. The context of them didn't exist in prior statute. They said they were a tool for nicotine addiction when they're actually ended up being a cause of nicotine addiction. Anybody doing something like that could think up a venture like that, understand what was right or wrong with their product, make billions, put mom and pop stores on every corner, and in 7 or 8 years before the government caught up and regulated, they would have already made their money and cashed out. And so this is the history of charlatanism. Which, I don't know if you know it or not, but I use this a lot, that the actual caveat emptor, the actual expression, is from a court case in the 1600s, and it was medical charlatanism. A consumer,
I did not know that.
A consumer had bought a bezoar stone, which is a gallstone from like a sheep that allegedly has healing powers, and it didn't work. So he took the seller to court. The court found in favor of the seller because the plaintiff could not prove that the seller didn't know that it wouldn't work when they sold it to him. And so I think it is Chandler Lupus. I want to say it's 1620, 1612 or something like that is the case. So right then it's like, so the burden of proof was put on the plaintiff, the citizen, to prove that this merchant was wrong.
Did Shakespeare? No, I guess that wasn't the Merchant of Venice. So, okay, I won't go over there.
Yeah, Chandler and Lupus is the court case if you look it up. But yeah.
So your point, and what comes across though is that we've thought of technology as something that's carefully planned, carefully executed. And yet you're suggesting that there's really not much difference between it and medicine in the sense that we will never anticipate all that could go awry. Yeah. We will never anticipate what other applications could derive from a new methodology. And in many instances, the very organizations or agencies we rely upon will always be looking backward to deal with those issues.
I think that's fair. I would probably shade it a little bit with a couple of thoughts. I think one that, yes, in general, most technologies, including medicine, are advanced through trial and error experimentation. Clinical trials are large trial and error experiments. You don't know until so that goes on. Now that said, human behavior is not a mystery to us. We know very well that in written history that technologies frequently have been weaponized as one of the first uses of them. I truly believe first person who figured out they could do something with a stick figured out they could hit the guy next to him with it, as the first bit of human.
So it wasn't to kill the dinosaur to eat. It was to, I see. All right.
Watch a couple of 2-year-olds playing.
Touche.
You know,
Touche.
And you see that. So again, so if I get into my cyber mind, right, and I think about things like black swans, and I think about known knowns, unknown, I feel I should be responsible for the known knowns because we know what they are. Like, we know exactly. So for example, I've written in my book and other places that, privacy, which again, I'm not actually such a huge fan of privacy. What's important to me is what privacy is supposed to protect, like, non-discrimination, autonomy, things like that. And like at one point I wrote a blog or a letter about the FDA clearance letter for the irregular heart rate notification feature of the Apple Watch. One of my criticisms is there wasn't a single statement in there about digital privacy or digital rights or anything like that in the clearance letter, saying that, how the data could be used for surveillance and all these other things like that, the responsibility of it. And it's not because I think it's all that device is that much of a risk. It's that if they start to note things in those clearance letters, the absence or irresponsibility about those things can be grounds for revoking the clearance.
Exactly.
So it's more a matter of why don't we do it? And the example I give about this all the time is if you look at what went on in some of the conversations around the California privacy law, and there was really a lot of push against it by a lot of the ad tech, health tech, a lot of the big data brokerage, and they basically say, well, our methods of de-identification are perfect. It's like, well, if they're perfect, why don't you offer a year of LifeLock to everybody in your data set? And like, well, because they're perfect. And it's like, well, if they're perfect, you're never going to have to write a check to do this. And it's a lot like, same thing. You talk to these people, it's like, well, how certain are you? And they'll say, well, I'm not uncertain. And so I think we have to cross over when we say, hey, so take something like clinical trials right now. We know that clinical trials are very poorly equitable, that a lot of populations aren't equitably included. And a lot of people say that digital is a great way to do that. And I'm a big believer that, digital can be one of the things that levels the playing field. Also, though, we are also talking about much more vulnerable populations. So, if we look at that, most people in clinical trials are kind of the white worried well, or whatever, and the, more privileged people, they actually have a lot of resilience if they get one bad mark on their credit or their identity. That's not true of people that are already living 150% below the poverty line, that have no credit. You know what I mean? They want to be able to cash their paycheck. So I think we have to think about the fact that when you think about digital justice, digital equity, you have to understand that there's already really systemic disparities built in. We saw this. Some of this really resonated, of course, early in COVID with the digital divide. Some homes don't have internet access. In medicine and digital health, one of the things that I had to comment on everybody was like, telehealth was so fantastic. And I love telehealth. Telehealth is fantastic. But you know what? If you look at the people that study this, there are real limitations. If you're somebody who is potentially being harmed at home, that closed door conversation at the doctor's office is the only place you're safe to talk about it. So it's just we've got to understand that that these technologies initially exacerbate these inequities. And the good news about that is if we know that, we should be working that way. We should be rolling it out that way. We should be thinking that way, as opposed to go grab the gold and then let somebody else kind of clean up the wake.
And an interesting thing, in the course of that answer, what really struck me was your ability to perceive this from a variety of perspectives. And that leads me to ask my next question. Back when Alex Azar was named to replace the initial appointment for Secretary of Health and Human Services, there were people who said, well, wait a minute, this guy spent part of his career as a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical company. And prior to that, he had actually been an executive of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies. On the flip side of that, there were people who said, well, it's about time that we had somebody in an agency who understands what the needs of the pharmaceutical industry are. your biography really describes a career that has afforded you a wealth of experience in an incredible variety of settings and posts, almost all of them related directly or indirectly to healthcare, including work with a major healthcare corporation, a federal regulatory agency, and research enterprise. So with that in mind, I'd like you to share with the listeners some of your experience when you've moved from, say, a regulatory entity. And yes, I know you were at FDA, but in that case, you were charged overall with the safety of a new drug. Let's use that example. And then you moved to a post at a research institute at a major university, and that university is an active participant in drug trials. And then you move from there to a company that put up much of the capital. This didn't happen, but put up much of the capital to support the work that led to a new drug's development. So the question I have is, was the change in your perspective when you moved, did it hit you almost immediately in each of those roles, or is it something that came along gradually? And did it cause you some sort of discomfort or conflict within yourself?
So the answer to the last question is no. I'll start there and then kind of say why.
Okay.
I've always really enjoyed figuring out how people make decisions. So, if I say I'm a researcher of data science, what I really do is study how people make decisions. Now, we have an issue right now where my former sponsor at Duke might be the next FDA commissioner. And there were some pieces out last week and some very similar things, kind of tossed out there. I think there's a couple things. I think one thing is that every human on the planet has biases, and a lot of them are unconscious, right? And what I have learned everywhere I've been is that the deeper and the more kind of monochromatic somebody's career background is, the more likely they're going to have bias against things that where they haven't been. Right. And it's not, what I've always said is, it's like, you've just walked in those shoes. You just have a sense of what goes on. This actually came to me before that. I was at Johnson & Johnson 13 years, and I basically went from a project manager to a VP in 7 of those years, and then to a senior VP in 9 of those years. And what isn't there is I kind of went in as a scientist, and about half the time I was running like lab science, and half the time I was moving up the IT ladder. Now, it was a great right brain, left brain thing, because the science at J&J was great, but in IT and at J&J is such a leadership engine that the leadership development in HR, finance, and IT was peerless. It was stellar. And what would often happen was I'd be running this research lab, and we'd be pushing bleeding edge science, and then they were ready to bring it big. My friends, my partners in IT didn't know how to do it. And so the CIO said, would you come over to this side of the line for 18 months and run this? Mm-hmm. Sure. And I learned to love all my family just as much, that way. And I truly benefited, as a J&J alum, and now advisor and pensioner, as a matter of fact, at the moment, that I really did work on different parts of my growing up. And it was very similar, when I went to FDA from J&J after 13 years, and got a sense of how hard that job is. You brought up how some people thought the industry background was great, and some people would think it was a barrier. You know what? I got to tell you, having reported to the commissioner of the FDA for a few years, I've never seen a place where the concepts being debated were so complex and even kind of even vicious, right? Played out in the press, where both sides were 100% right. Mm-hmm. It was, and I have nothing but respect for that. And I think the answer is, a lot of that conversations, I'll come out, someone says, well, what you're kind of saying is because you're biased about something, you expect this other person's going to transference. I'm actually biased about big pharma, so I think they're going to be biased because they work with big pharma, right? Or the opposite. Right. Mm-hmm. I'm a regulator. My job has been to keep these charlatans in pharma from selling poisons to unsuspecting people at outrageous amounts of money. Right. You hear both of those sides, and neither are right, neither are 100% wrong. And so I think the idea is, for me, I've enjoyed the adaptation. I've enjoyed kind of getting in there. I think every time it's made me better at everything else. And it's because what I love about it is the learning those different perspectives.
And it's interesting that you say that, because some of the some of our previous guests who've had time in a nonprofit or government say the exact same thing. The contrast was not conflict. It was contrast.
It was
exactly that.
No, sometimes there was contention or conflict involved.
Mhm.
But that's good, right? Because you need to put it out there. I mean, like I have been at FDA a year, and someone might come and say, "But you're a pharma guy." You know what I mean? It's like it's like, you know what? I'm actually really glad they put that on the table, right? Because it's better than not knowing it was there,
Mhm.
right? So that's a gift. When people share their biases, it's a gift. I think, as long as they're conscious that they're sharing it. If they're sharing it, they're ignorant. That's a totally different story.
It's really scary when they don't share it.
They don't share. Yeah, you just do the outcome. But I do think that, as a, and that's one of the reasons why I always knew I would retire as an academic, because I think, one, the freedom of it. I get to work with everybody I like from this post. I get to help FDA, I get to help, NIH, I get to help pharma companies that are doing good, and I get to pick what I think is worth doing, right? But also it's because I actually respect all their different missions in their conflict and enlightenment and ignorance all at the same time of kind of what's going on. My only rule is that mean people suck. Other than that, I think you can figure it out. If someone's just being mean or ugly or not, that's a different thing.
Is that on a plaque behind your wall, on your wall back there?
I got a t-shirt. Yeah, it's a t-shirt.
But in a way, you touched on another question then, and that is one of the things we explore a lot, because we're a company that goes out and looks for leadership, people that take leadership positions. And in some ways, I think you've started to address another question we're curious about, and that is, there's a school of thought that says, wait a minute, good leaders are good leaders, or good leaders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when you ask them, can you tell me the 5 or 6? They'll tell you the 5 or 6. And then usually they'll add a little bit of this, something that's specific to the industry or whatever. One of the things we've been curious about is, because the fact that change in both old line industries and new industries the pace of change is, one, global. It's on a global scale now. 2, it happens so fast. And 3, everything seems to be interconnected. So once you do something, it starts out that butterfly wing effect. For you, are there some generic leadership attributes that are important to you? Are there those specific things that are specific to a domain or a discipline? And are those two things pretty much of comparable weight and substance in terms of making for good leadership?
I think so. I think that, for me, one is I do think that leadership, is relative to stage of career and roles and things like that. The thing I needed to be a successful 42-year-old SVP at J&J is different what I needed to be, 5 or 10 years later for that, right? Because certain environments drive different types of things. Having always been in technology and medicine, I think first and foremost, and in the fields that I'm in, that technical competency and substance is really, really important. There's just a lot of people who are running black boxes, and it's really obvious they don't understand how it works.
You touched on something that it's precisely what our concern is that there are people who placed in leader position who can't be bothered with the details, and yet the details in some cases are so fundamental to what change is being brought about.
Yeah, so my view is that, this is my bias because it's what's worked for me, it's actually the leadership ability to know how far to go in the detail to get that ends up really being when I was helping build the cancer center in Amman, Jordan, I actually just learned enough Arabic so people stopped speaking it in front of me. That's all I needed to learn. When I was at FDA and I was a CIO, I did one code review of something. I never had to do another code review because I was a CIO who did code reviews, right? And it's meaningful though. It's the experience, it's the immersion. It allows you to get down with the people in your organization, get to issues. But at the same time, you can't live down there. If you live down there and start missing that big picture. And I think that's why I say, for me, it's easier because, I'm a physical scientist in a lot of ways. So I live in a very kind of material world. I don't understand like marketing and product and a lot of these other things that are fun to me to think about. It's very foreign to me. Physical science, physical chemistry, medicine, surgery, these, technology and code. These are things I can get my mind around and get to in a detailed level, because they're primarily technology or biological systems. They're not human systems. I think I wouldn't be nearly as, marketing to me, for example, it's like a human system thing. You're trying to understand how people behave. And all I know is people behave crazy. That's all I can tell you, but I can tell you about, how something works biochemically. So for me, it's been that. I also, so I think there's that. The other thing is, I do, but that said, I actually do think equally as important are more what I said are kind of like the cost of entry leadership capability, energy, optimism, curiosity, openness, curiosity. It's funny because I'm one of those leaders that has been very public for a long time. And my Myers-Briggs test as strong an introvert as you can imagine. And
wait, I thought you were going to tell me you failed the Myers-Briggs, and I was going to explain.
I think the first time I ever did, I was an INTJ, which I think is failing.
That's failing. That's not good. That's not what you want.
When J&J tested me, I was an INTJ. Like I was better, like I was a director level person. Yeah. So I technically failed. I was fine with that. But what was funny is they tested me much later, and a lot of that had shifted.
Okay.
And moved much more towards kind of the middle. It was just maturity. It was just, having been a leader and getting to like people and, being focused, when you start off and you've got a PhD and you're an engineer, also you're very focused on the technical things, and the details, and you've got to shake that academic mindset of I'm smarter than this guy or any of that type of stuff, and realize that, working with that guy is more important than whether or not you're smarter than that guy, and all the other stuff that the competitive parts of grad school and stuff that you shake off, so some academics never shake it off, but anyway, neither do some business people either. But so so to your point, I actually think it's equal weight. I think there's a domain specific set of things, technology capability, those sort of, but then there are attributes. Similarly, I think there are attributes when it's failing. So for example, one of the ones I've seen is a really inspirational leader that simply continues to surround themselves with the wrong people. If you can't pick the right leaders and know that you can be good at everything else and your org is going to fail. It's just that's the wrong blind spot to have. If you're a person and all your people have no credibility, and it's not because their job is to make you look at, I actually don't subscribe, but it's because you have to be able to make them successful. And if they're not credible and people are giving up on them, you aren't doing that.
Let me take you into one more realm before we close. A couple of years ago, the London's National Theatre put on a remarkable performance of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And it was an extraordinary success, just a remarkable success. And someone became interested in why a story about Frankenstein and so forth would resonate so much with an audience. And they began asking them. And it turned out that for a large number of people, the reason they were so impressed and so engaged was because they thought that we were running to the point where creating life from dead tissue might really be possible. I start with that because I can also bring up instances where we do surgery now on people whose livers are failing. And if we can find somebody who is genetically compatible, we can cut out a small piece of the person's liver, put it in the person whose liver is failing. And if things go well, that person is spared a death penalty. We can go further, maybe a little more complex. We have people now who make it very hard for us to know exactly how to address them, whether they're Mr. or Miss or Mrs. or whatever, because those individuals have chosen to change their sexual identity. And because of the technology that we've developed, we can make a person's gender at birth change relatively dramatically. And yet the words we have to talk about that aren't very good. We live in an age of wonders, I guess. And I'd be curious to know, you have been involved in some wonders yourself. As you look out over the next 10 years, are there some things coming down the road as probably the fruit of technology and scientific and medical research that you can envision now?
So it's a great question. We continue to figure out what was the natural world, especially the natural world of biology. And if we can figure it out, we can manipulate it. And in general, I think that's going well. And we have to hope that humanity can police humanity. The big example for me was a few years ago, the whole human cloning thing, right? That, in the world responded very, very,
Yes.
sharply to that, both politically and ethically. So that was good. So I think there's a lot of good there. And I do think we're trying to move ethics and progress and what good looks like ahead, to give people choices for how their life, their short time on this planet will go. I think that's good stuff. I think the flip side of that is, one, I think technologically we continue to come up with ever better ways to just decimate humanity. And it doesn't have to be nuclear. You could read Nicole Pelroth's book. This is how they say the word. It's right. There's a million things like that. All of those things are very true, right? So we're simultaneously developing technologies that can be really, really catastrophic. I guess I feel two things about this. I think one, I don't think we know what our limits of what we're going to be able to do are. I don't think we can see what our limits are. I think in time we may figure out physics is different than what we thought it was. But at the same time, as human beings, we're slowly but steadily losing the ability to have a simple debate or conversation. And those two things to me are highly incompatible. That we can't have intelligent, rational discourse. And yet at the same time, we're getting to the point where a guy in a coffee shop can wield weapons of mass destruction. I think we have a lot to think about there. And I do think that in some ways, the least of which is the well-intentioned mistake by a health innovator that's trying to do the right thing and steps in it. I think that is always going to be part of technology progress and stuff like that. And as long as hopefully nobody was really hurt and they learned from it, it's, we're again, trial and error experiments. But I do think we have to somehow build social constructs that can support the technology advances we're making, be they in silico or be they biological.
A very thoughtful answer. Sir, it's been a real pleasure to have you on Innovators. I hope we have a chance to come back and visit you in the near future. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.